Montana Territory, 1885. The cruel April wind swept across the rolling grasslands, carrying the smoke from distant wildfires that had raged through the nearby forests just days before. Pearl Miller clutched the letter in her trembling hands, the black-edged stationery announcing what her heart already knew. She was a widow at 23. The homestead she stood upon, with its half-built barn and modest cabin, had been her husband Thomas's dream. Now it was her burden, a 30-acre reminder of everything she had lost when that mining accident took him just 6 months after their wedding day. "What am I to do now?" she whispered to the empty prairie stretching before her. Her honey-blonde hair, usually neatly pinned, whipped across her tear-stained face as she stood on the porch in her faded blue calico dress. The distant sound of hoofbeats made her quickly wipe her eyes. In these parts, strangers could mean trouble, and a young woman alone had to be cautious. As the rider approached, Pearl recognized the distinctive pinto belonging to Zachary Quinn, the youngest and most reserved of the cowhands from the neighboring Diamond Creek Ranch. Zach, as everyone called him, pulled his horse to a stop and removed his hat, revealing a shock of sun-bleached brown hair. At 24, he was lean and strong from years of ranch work, his face tanned but unscarred by the harsh elements, with just a hint of stubble along his jaw. "Miss Miller," he said, his voice soft with respect. "I heard about Mr. Miller. I'm right sorry for your loss, ma'am." Pearl nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She had only met Zach a handful of times when Thomas had hired him and some other men to help with the initial cabin raising. He had always been polite, but kept to himself. "I was wondering," he continued, shifting uncomfortably in his saddle, "if you might need any help around here? With the planting season coming and all." "That's kind," Pearl replied, finally finding her voice. "But I can't pay wages now." Thomas left little behind besides debt and dreams. Zach's blue eyes met hers directly. "I wasn't looking to be paid, Miss Miller. Just thought it might be the neighborly thing to do." Something in his earnest expression made Pearl wonder if there was more to this offer than simple kindness. Had Thomas asked this young man to look after her should anything happen? Or was there another reason entirely for his unexpected appearance? "Perhaps you'd like to come in for coffee," she offered, surprising herself with the invitation. As Zach tied his horse to the hitching post, neither of them noticed the dust cloud on the horizon, signaling the approach of riders who would change both their lives forever. Inside the cabin, Pearl's hands trembled as she prepared the coffee. The small interior was neat but sparse, a table with 4 mismatched chairs, a cast-iron stove, and a few shelves holding their meager possessions. A curtain separated the small bedroom from the main living area. "It's a good piece of land," Zach said, breaking the uncomfortable silence as he sat at the table, hat in his hands. "Mr. Miller chose well. He had such plans," Pearl said, her voice catching. She placed a steaming mug before him. "The barn was going to be twice the size of what's standing. He wanted cattle, not just crops. He mentioned that to me," Zach nodded. "Said this valley had the best grass he'd ever seen." Pearl looked at him with surprise. "You and Thomas spoke about the ranch?" "Yes, ma'am. He hired me a few times for odd jobs. He was proud of what he was building here." Zach paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Mr. Miller worried about leaving you alone while he worked the mines. He made me promise that if anything happened." The sound of multiple horses approaching cut him off. Both turned toward the window as 6 riders pulled up to the cabin. "Were you expecting company?" Zach asked, standing protectively. "No," Pearl whispered, her heart racing. Zach's hand moved instinctively to his hip, where his revolver rested. "Stay inside," he instructed, moving toward the door. Before he reached it, a loud knock sounded, and a familiar voice called out, "Mrs. Miller?" "It's Sheriff Davis and some men from town." Pearl exhaled with relief and moved past Zach to open the door. Sheriff Davis stood on her porch, flanked by 5 men she recognized from Copper Creek: the blacksmith, the general store owner, and 3 ranchers from the valley. "Mrs. Miller," the sheriff began, removing his hat, "we've come about your situation here." Pearl stiffened. "My situation?" "The land," he clarified. "With Mr. Miller gone, there's been talk in town about who might take over this property. Malcolm Jenkins has expressed interest in buying you out." Malcolm Jenkins was the owner of the largest cattle operation in the territory, a man known for expanding his holdings by whatever means necessary. "I'm not selling," Pearl said firmly. This was Thomas's dream, and I intend to make it work." The sheriff exchanged glances with the other men. "No disrespect intended, ma'am, but ranching isn't a woman's work. And with that loan coming due at the bank." Pearl felt the blood drain from her face. "How did they know about the loan?" "I believe Mrs. Miller has made her intentions clear," Zach said, stepping forward. The other men seemed surprised to find him there. "Quinn," the sheriff acknowledged with a nod. "This isn't your affair." "I've offered to help Mrs. Miller with the ranch," Zach replied evenly. "So I believe it is." The men exchanged meaningful glances, and Pearl wondered what unspoken message passed between them. Did they know something about Zach that she didn't? "Very well," the sheriff said finally. "But Jenkins isn't a man who takes no for an answer. And that loan payment is due in 30 days. Just consider your options, Mrs. Miller." After they departed, Pearl sank into a chair. 30 days, she whispered. "I'd forgotten about the bank loan with everything else." "How much?" Zach asked quietly. $200. An impossible sum for a widow with no income. Zach was silent for a long moment. "The barn needs finishing first," he finally said. "Can't run cattle without proper shelter. I'll be here at sunup tomorrow." "Mr. Quinn," Pearl protested, "I can't accept charity." "It's not charity," he said firmly. "It's a partnership. You provide the land, I'll provide the labor. We split whatever profit comes." He paused. "Unless you'd rather sell to Jenkins." Pearl studied his face, searching for deceit or ulterior motives, but found only determination and something else, something that made her heart beat a little faster. "Why would you do this for a woman you barely know?" she asked. Zach stood and placed his hat back on his head. "Let's just say I have my reasons," he answered cryptically. "I'll return tomorrow with my things." As she watched him ride away, Pearl couldn't help but wonder what secrets Zachary Quinn was keeping, and whether trusting him would be her salvation or her downfall. True to his word, Zach arrived at dawn the next day with his bedroll, tools, and a wagon filled with lumber. "For the barn," he explained when Pearl's eyes widened at the sight. "Got it at a good price from the sawmill." "How did you afford all this?" she asked, suspicious. A shadow crossed his face. "I've been saving for my own place someday. This is a better investment than letting it sit in a bank." Over the next days, Zach worked tirelessly from sunrise to sunset, sleeping in the unfinished barn. Pearl found herself watching him from the cabin window as he hammered, sawed, and built with focused determination. There was something graceful about the way he moved, powerful but precise. By the end of the first week, the barn's frame was complete, and Pearl had fallen into a routine of cooking meals for them both. They would eat together in the evening, their conversations gradually becoming less awkward and more genuine. "You never speak of your family," Pearl observed one night as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. Zach was silent for so long she thought he might not answer. "My father was a drunk," he finally said. "Mother died when I was 14. I've been on my own since." "I'm sorry," Pearl said softly. "Don't be. Made me who I am." His eyes met hers in the fading light. "What about you? Any family back east?" Pearl shook her head. "My parents died of influenza when I was 16. I was working as a seamstress in Chicago when I met Thomas." He painted such beautiful pictures of Montana with his words. "I fell in love with the dream as much as the man." "And now?" Zach asked. "Do you still love the dream?" Pearl looked out at the land spreading before them, wild, demanding, but breathtakingly beautiful. "I think I'm beginning to see it through new eyes." The moment was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. 3 riders appeared in the twilight, and Pearl recognized Malcolm Jenkins leading them. Jenkins, a bear of a man with a silver-streaked beard and cold eyes, dismounted with surprising agility for his size. "Mrs. Miller," he called out, "I see you've found yourself some help." Zach stood, positioning himself slightly in front of Pearl. "Mr. Jenkins," Pearl acknowledged coolly. "What brings you here?" "Neighborly visit," Jenkins replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Heard you were fixing up the place. Thought I'd see for myself." His gaze swept over the half-built barn and newly plowed fields before settling on Zach. "Quinn, isn't it? Surprised to see you here. Word was you were saving for your own spread." "Plans change," Zach replied tersely. Jenkins nodded thoughtfully. "Indeed they do. Well, Mrs. Miller, my offer to buy still stands. $500. More than fair for undeveloped land." "This land is not for sale, Mr. Jenkins," Pearl replied firmly. "Not at any price." The rancher's expression hardened. I admire your spirit, but sentiment is poor business. This valley needs cattle, not crops. And ranching takes money, money you don't have. He looked pointedly at Zach. Money your hired hand doesn't have either. I appreciate your concern, Pearl said, standing taller. But we'll manage. Jenkins remounted his horse. We'll see about that. Water rights in this territory can be complicated. Shame if your crops dried up before harvest. With a nod to his men, they rode away. Was that a threat? Pearl asked, her voice shaking despite her effort to appear strong. Yes, Zach said grimly. Jenkins wants this land because it controls access to the upper valley grazing areas. He's not a man who takes no for an answer. What did he mean about water rights? Zach's expression darkened. The creek that feeds your irrigation ditches runs through Jenkins' property before it gets here. If he diverts it, he can't do that, can he? Pearl asked, alarmed. Legally? No, but law moves slow out here. Zach looked toward the retreating riders. We need to work faster, and we need help. The next morning, Pearl was awakened by the sound of multiple wagons arriving. She hurriedly dressed and stepped outside to find a sight that took her breath away. At least 20 men had gathered in her yard. Cowboys from neighboring ranches, shopkeepers from town, farmers from nearby homesteads. Among them, she recognized several women carrying baskets of food. Zach stood in the center of the group, giving directions. When he saw Pearl, he approached with a smile that transformed his usually serious face. What is all this? She asked in amazement. Help, he said simply. Turns out I'm not the only one who doesn't care for Jenkins' way of doing business. An older woman stepped forward. I'm Esther Thompson, dear. My husband and I have the dairy farm east of town. We all heard what Jenkins is trying to do. And, well, we take care of our own in this valley. Throughout the day, the men worked in teams, some finishing the barn, others repairing fences, still others helping with the plowing and planting. The women set up a communal kitchen, preparing meals and organizing supplies. Pearl moved among them, overwhelmed by their generosity. Why would you all do this for me? She asked Samuel Donovan, the town's blacksmith, as he repaired her broken plow. Jenkins has been squeezing small ranchers for years, Donovan explained, hammering with practiced precision. Buying up land, controlling the cattle market. If he gets your water rights, half the farmers in the lower valley will suffer. And, he added with a knowing smile, folks respect a young woman with grit. Plus, young Quinn there has friends he doesn't even know about. Pearl glanced over at Zach, who was directing a team raising the barn roof. What do you mean? That boy's been working honest and hard since he was 16. Never complains, never asks for help. Sends money to widows and orphans from the church collection plate when he thinks no one's looking. The blacksmith winked. Some of us noticed. As the sun began to set, the transformation of the ranch was remarkable. The barn stood complete, the fields were plowed and partly planted, and the cabin had a new roof and porch steps. As the helpers prepared to leave, one of the ranchers approached with for young heifers. A start to your herd, Mrs. Miller, he said. They're good breeding stock. Pearl was speechless with gratitude. As the last wagons rolled away, she turned to Zach, who stood beside her in the twilight. How did you arrange all this? She asked. He looked embarrassed. I just mentioned at the saloon that Jenkins was threatening your water. Word spread. Pearl knew there had to be more to it than that, but before she could press him, the distant sound of rushing water caught their attention. The creek, Zach exclaimed, already running toward the irrigation ditches. They arrived to find water pouring through the channel at twice its normal volume, flooding the newly planted fields. Jenkins, Zach growled. He's released a dam upstream. He's trying to wash out the seeds we just planted. Through the night, they worked desperately to divert the water, building makeshift barriers and digging emergency channels. By dawn, they had managed to save most of the fields, but both were exhausted and soaked to the bone. As they trudged back to the cabin in the early morning light, Pearl stumbled from fatigue. Zach caught her, his strong arms supporting her. For a moment, they stood close, her hands against his chest, his arms around her waist. Thank you, she whispered, suddenly aware of how close his face was to hers, of the way his eyes reflected the rising sun. Zach stepped back, breaking the moment. You should rest, he said gruffly. I'll check the fields again. Pearl watched him go, confused by the sudden tension between them and the unexpected disappointment she felt at his withdrawal. Was she developing feelings for this quiet, mysterious man? And if so, was she betraying Thomas's memory? As the days passed, the community continued to rally around Pearl's ranch. Men would arrive in the evenings after finishing their own work to help with tasks too big for Zach alone. Women brought preserves and seeds from their gardens. Children came to help gather eggs from the newly built henhouse. One afternoon, 2 weeks after the flood, Pearl found Zach sitting on a stump behind the barn, studying a worn piece of paper. "What's that?" she asked, setting down the basket of eggs she had collected. Zach quickly folded the paper, but not before Pearl glimpsed what looked like a deed. "Nothing important," he said, tucking it into his shirt pocket. Pearl sat beside him. "You've done so much for me, Zach, but I still don't understand why. And I think I deserve to know the truth." He was silent for a long moment, his expression troubled. Finally, he pulled out the paper and handed it to her. "Your husband and I had an agreement." Pearl unfolded the document. A crude but legal contract stating that in exchange for a loan of $200, Thomas Miller offered Zachary Quinn a quarter share in the ranch. "Thomas borrowed money from you?" Pearl asked, stunned. "But where would you get such a sum?" 5 years of wages saved, ma'am. Every penny I could spare." Zach stared at his hands. "I wanted land of my own, but couldn't afford a full homestead. Your husband needed money for supplies. It seemed a fair arrangement. Why didn't you tell me this when you first came? Didn't seem right, coming to a widow with a claim against her property." He met her eyes. "I wasn't sure how to approach it." Then Jenkins started circling, and it seemed more important to protect the ranch than worry about my investment. Pearl studied the contract, dated just weeks before Thomas's death. "So everything you've done, the barn, bringing the community together, it wasn't just kindness. It was protecting your investment." Hurt laced her voice, though she tried to hide it. Had she misinterpreted his actions completely? Zach stood abruptly. "The contract gives me rights to a quarter share, Mrs. Miller, not the obligation to build a barn, plant fields, or fight Jenkins. I did those things because—" He stopped, seeming to struggle with his words. "Because why?" Pearl pressed, standing to face him. "Because I've never met anyone like you," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "Someone willing to fight for a dream, even when everything seems stacked against them. Because every day I spend here makes me want to be part of that dream." The honesty in his eyes took her breath away. Before she could respond, the sound of gunshots echoed from the direction of the creek. "Stay here," Zach ordered, grabbing his rifle from where it leaned against the barn. "No," Pearl said firmly, picking up the shotgun she had learned to use for protection. "This is my ranch too." They arrived at the creek to find 3 of Jenkins' men attempting to build a dam that would divert the water away from Pearl's property. One had fired warning shots at a young boy who had discovered them, the son of a neighboring farmer who had been helping check the water flow. "That's enough," Zach called out, his rifle steady. "You're trespassing on private property and threatening a child." The men turned, hands hovering near their weapons. The leader, a hard-faced cowboy Pearl recognized as Jenkins' foreman, sneered at them. "This creek water belongs to Mr. Jenkins," he claimed. "He's merely reclaiming what's his." "Water rights in this territory follow the natural flow," Pearl stated, her shotgun unwavering despite her racing heart. "This creek has fed this land for generations. You know that." "Maybe so," the foreman replied. "But possession is 9/10 of the law, and we possess this creek now." He nodded toward the partially constructed dam. The standoff might have escalated further if not for the arrival of Sheriff Davis and several armed men from town. Someone had alerted them to Jenkins' scheme. "Wilson," the sheriff addressed Jenkins' foreman. "You boys want to explain what you're doing on Mrs. Miller's property with weapons drawn?" The confrontation ended with Jenkins' men being escorted away, but Pearl knew this was only a temporary victory. As they walked back to the ranch, she turned to Zach. "Jenkins won't stop," she said, "and the bank payment is due in less than 2 weeks." "I've been thinking about that," Zach replied. "The cattle we've gathered are a start, but not enough to generate immediate income." He hesitated, then continued. "There's a cattle auction in Helena next week. Prime stock is selling high. If we could get a small herd there, where would we get more cattle?" Pearl asked. Zach's expression grew determined. "There are wild herds in the North Hills. Unclaimed. If we could round up 20 head, break them to drive." "That's rustling," Pearl protested. "Not if they're unbranded," Zach countered. It's risky, but legal. The plan was desperate, but might work. Over the next days, Zach recruited several trusted cowboys who owed him favors. Together, they rode into the rugged hills and, after 3 grueling days, managed to round up 18 wild steers. Breaking them to drive was dangerous work. Pearl watched anxiously as Zach was thrown repeatedly, always getting up to try again. His determination was matched only by his skill, and gradually, the wild cattle were tamed enough to move. The night before Zach was to leave for Helena with the cattle, Pearl found him sitting alone by a small fire outside the barn. "You should be resting," she said softly, settling beside him. "Tomorrow will be a long day." "Couldn't sleep," he admitted. "Too many thoughts." Pearl understood. The success or failure of this venture would determine the fate of her ranch. Their ranch, she corrected mentally. "I've been thinking about what happens after," she said carefully. "If we succeed in paying off the bank." Zach looked at her, the firelight casting shadows across his features. "What do you mean?" "This partnership," she clarified. "Your quarter share. How do you see it working between us?" "I hadn't thought that far ahead," he admitted. "Been focused on saving what we have." "Well, I have been thinking about it," Pearl continued, gathering her courage. "And I believe we should formalize our arrangement. Not just as business partners, but as—" She faltered, suddenly uncertain. Was she being too forward? Would he think her presumptuous or, worse, opportunistic? Zach turned fully toward her, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. "As what, Pearl?" It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it in his deep voice sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cool night air. Before she could respond, a rider approached at speed. It was one of the young cowboys who had helped with the cattle drive preparations. "Quinn," he called out urgently. "Jenkins and his men are headed this way. At least 10 riders, all armed." Zach was on his feet instantly. "How far?" "Maybe 20 minutes behind me. They're coming to take the cattle." Pearl felt cold fear grip her heart. "How did they know?" "Must have had someone watching us," Zach said grimly. "We need to move the cattle now." "But it's night," Pearl protested. "The drive wasn't planned until morning." "We don't have until morning." Zach was already saddling his horse. "Get to the cabin and stay there," he instructed Pearl. "Lock the doors." "This is my ranch too," she reminded him firmly. "I can ride, and you need every hand you can get." Their eyes met in a silent battle of wills. Finally, Zach nodded. "Stay close to me." What followed was a chaotic night drive through unfamiliar territory. Zach, Pearl, and the 3 cowboys who had helped gather the herd pushed the cattle hard, taking little-used trails through the foothills to avoid Jenkins' men. Dawn found them exhausted but safe, having put considerable distance between themselves and their pursuers. They stopped briefly to rest the animals near a small stream. "You ride well," Zach commented to Pearl as they watered the horses. "Thomas taught me," she replied, splashing cold water on her face. "He said a rancher's wife should know how to do everything a rancher does." "Smart man," Zach said quietly. "He would be proud of you." Pearl straightened, studying Zach's face in the early morning light. "Did you know Thomas well?" "Sometimes I get the feeling there was more between you than just that business arrangement." Zach was silent for a moment, seeming to debate with himself. "We served together," he finally said. "In the war, at the end. I was just a boy, lied about my age to enlist. Thomas saved my life at Appomattox, took a bullet meant for me." Pearl's hand flew to her mouth. "He never told me." "He wouldn't have. Wasn't his way to speak of such things." Zach looked away. "When I ran into him years later in Montana, it seemed like fate. He needed money, I needed land. But mostly, I wanted to repay a debt I could never fully settle." The revelation changed everything in Pearl's understanding. Zach's devotion to the ranch, to her, it wasn't just about business or even attraction. It was about honor, about a promise to a friend. "So when you came that first day," she said slowly, "it wasn't just about your investment." "No," he admitted. "Thomas made me promise that if anything happened to him, I'd look after you, help you keep the dream alive." He met her eyes directly. But what started as a promise has become something else entirely. The moment was interrupted by one of the cowboys riding back from scouting ahead. "Road's clear to Helena," he reported. "If we push hard, we can make the auction by tomorrow noon." They arrived in Helena with the cattle intact, though all were exhausted from the difficult journey. The auction was already underway, the livestock pens crowded with buyers and sellers from across the territory. As they guided their wild steers into the holding pens, Pearl noticed several men watching them with interest. "Those are Jenkins buyers," Zach explained in a low voice. "He supplies the mining companies with beef. If they recognize our cattle as being from the North Hills, will they?" Pearl asked anxiously. "Let's hope not." Their turn at auction came late in the day. As the auctioneer called for bids on their prime grass-fed beef, Pearl held her breath. The opening bid was low, but quickly rose as buyers recognized the quality of the meat despite the wild appearance of the steers. Just as it seemed they would get a fair price, one of Jenkins' men stood. "Those cattle are stolen," he called out, causing a murmur through the crowd. "They're from the Jenkins North Range herd." "That's a lie." Zach stepped forward. "These are unbranded cattle from open range. Jenkins doesn't own every head of stock in the territory." "Where's your bill of sale?" challenged the man. "Don't need one for unbranded cattle legally gathered," Zach countered. The auctioneer looked uncomfortable. "Can anyone verify your claim?" Before Zach could respond, a distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit stepped forward. "I can." Pearl recognized Judge Morrison, the territorial circuit judge who occasionally held court in Copper Creek. "These cattle are indeed from the North Hills," the judge confirmed. "And Mr. Quinn is correct. Unbranded cattle on open range are legally available to whoever can gather them. Furthermore," he added with authority, "I have personally reviewed the territorial maps, and the North Hills are not part of any registered claim, including Mr. Jenkins' holdings." The auction proceeded, and by the end, they had earned enough to pay the bank loan with money to spare. As they concluded their business, Judge Morrison approached them. "Mr. Quinn, Mrs. Miller," he greeted them. "A moment of your time?" They stepped aside with him, and the judge spoke quietly. "Jenkins is a powerful man with many connections, but his methods have not gone unnoticed. The territorial governor has received numerous complaints about his attempts to monopolize water and grazing rights." "Will anything be done?" Pearl asked. "Indeed. An investigation has been opened." The judge handed Zach an envelope. "This is an injunction preventing Jenkins or his men from interfering with your water rights or property. It won't stop him entirely, but it will give legal weight to your position." As they prepared to return to the ranch with their earnings and the legal protection, Pearl felt a weight lift from her shoulders. For the first time since Thomas's death, the future seemed possible rather than overwhelming. The journey home was less hurried, but no less tense. They rode alert, expecting an ambush from Jenkins' men that never materialized. Upon reaching the ranch, they found everything undisturbed. "Strange," Zach commented as they dismounted in the yard. "I was certain Jenkins would try something while we were gone." His answer came the next morning when Sheriff Davis arrived with news. "Jenkins was arrested yesterday in Butte," he informed them. "Seems the territorial governor had been building a case against him for water rights violations and intimidation. Your situation was the final evidence they needed." "So it's over?" Pearl asked, hardly daring to believe it. "Jenkins will likely pay a fine and be released eventually," the sheriff cautioned, "but his reputation is damaged. The big mining companies don't want to do business with someone who attracts government scrutiny." After the sheriff departed, Pearl found Zach in the newly completed barn, organizing tools. The payment to the bank had been made, their immediate crisis averted. Now they faced a different kind of uncertainty. "So," she said, breaking the silence between them, "what happens now?" Zach straightened, turning to face her. In the golden light filtering through the barn slats, he looked younger, the worry of recent weeks easing from his features. "That depends on you," he replied. "The contract gives me a quarter share, but if you'd prefer to buy me out, I'd understand. The ranch is yours by right." Pearl stepped closer to him. "And if I don't want to buy you out? If I want you to stay?" "As a partner," he asked, his voice low. "Perhaps more than that," she said softly, her heart pounding. "Before Jenkins' men interrupted us that night, I was trying to say something important." Zach closed the distance between them, his blue eyes searching her face. "I'm listening now." Pearl gathered her courage. "I know it hasn't been long since Thomas died, and some might think it improper, but these past weeks have shown me that life is unpredictable and precious. What I feel for you isn't just gratitude, Zach. It's something more, something I didn't expect to find again." "Pearl," he breathed her name like a prayer. "I came here to fulfill a promise to a friend, but I stayed because of you. Because every day I spend with you makes me want to be a better man." His hand gently cupped her cheek, and Pearl leaned into his touch. I don't want a business partner, Zach. I want a life partner. Someone to share this dream with, to build something lasting. Are you asking me to marry you, Pearl Miller? A smile tugged at his lips. I believe I am, she replied, returning his smile. Though it's terribly forward of me. I've never been one for convention anyway, he said, drawing her closer. And my answer is yes. Their first kiss was gentle, a promise of deeper passion to come. When they finally parted, both were smiling, the future suddenly bright with possibility. 3 weeks later, the ranch witnessed another gathering of the community, this time to celebrate a wedding. Under an arbor built by the same hands that had raised the barn, Pearl and Zach exchanged vows before Judge Morrison and the friends who had helped save their home. Pearl wore a simple white dress adorned with wildflowers, her honey blonde hair arranged in elegant curls. Zach, clean-shaven and slightly uncomfortable in his new suit, couldn't take his eyes off her. After the ceremony, as their neighbors and friends celebrated around them, the newlyweds slipped away to the porch of their cabin. The setting sun bathed the valley in gold, highlighting the thriving fields, the sturdy barn, and the small herd of cattle grazing peacefully. It's beautiful, Pearl said, leaning against her husband's shoulder. Yes, Zach agreed, but he wasn't looking at the land. His eyes were fixed on her face, full of wonder and love. Do you think Thomas would approve? She asked quietly. It was the first time she had mentioned her first husband since their engagement. Zach considered the question seriously. I think he loved you enough to want your happiness above all else. And he trusted me to keep my word. Which you did, Pearl said, turning to face him. You saved his dream. No, Zach corrected gently, taking her hands in his. We built our own. As darkness fell over the Montana landscape, lights appeared across the valley. Lanterns in the windows of neighbors and friends who had come together to help a young widow rebuild her life and find love again. From tragedy had come community, from loss had come connection, and from the ashes of one dream, another had been born, stronger for having been forged in adversity and warmed by the hearts of those who believed in second chances.